When all four engines died at 37,000 feet, 312 passengers prepared for the impossible. A quiet farmer in economy class stood up and guided the powerless jet to a miraculous landing. But when military F-22 fighter pilots learned who she really was, they went completely silent over their radios, stunned speechless by the legend they had just witnessed. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 747-400 designated as Transglobal Flight 312 maintained its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet with the mechanical precision that had made the aircraft legendary across 4 decades of commercial service. Captain Michael Torres had flown this route 73 times during his 28-year career, and the pre-dawn departure from Seattle to Tokyo represented another routine crossing that his muscle memory could execute while his conscious mind wandered through weekend plans and retirement calculations that felt increasingly concrete with each passing month. The aircraft carried 312 souls through darkness above the Pacific Northwest, its 4 massive Pratt & Whitney engines producing thrust so reliable that total failure existed only in theoretical discussions and training manuals that covered the scenario with clinical detachment reserved for events considered statistically impossible. Torres had accumulated 14,000 flight hours without experiencing even dual-engine failure, and the idea that all 4 power plants might simultaneously cease functioning belonged to nightmare scenarios that pilots acknowledged existed but never actually expected to encounter during careers spanning entire lifetimes. First Officer Jessica Ramon monitored instruments displaying normal parameters across every system while Flight Engineer David Park reviewed fuel consumption rates that matched predictions with reassuring accuracy. The cockpit maintained its characteristic pre-dawn atmosphere of focused calm, 3 experienced professionals managing a machine whose complexity had become intuitive through countless repetitions that transformed technical procedures into instinctive responses requiring minimal conscious attention. The first indication arrived without drama or warning, just a subtle vibration transmitted through the airframe that lasted perhaps 2 seconds before engine number 3's parameters began declining with horrifying speed. Torres had reflexively reached for restart procedures when Engine 2 joined the failure cascade, its instruments displaying identical degradation patterns suggesting systematic rather than isolated malfunction. Within 8 seconds, all 4 engines had transitioned from normal operation to complete silence, their turbines spinning down as fuel flow ceased despite every indication suggesting adequate supply and proper system function. The massive aircraft continued forward through momentum alone, its 400 tons of metal and humanity suddenly transformed from powered flight into ballistic trajectory governed entirely by physics that would not negotiate or grant extensions regardless of desperation or skill. Torres experienced a moment of absolute cognitive dissonance as his decades of experience insisted this situation could not exist while his instruments confirmed with merciless clarity that all 4 engines had indeed failed simultaneously, creating an emergency that exceeded anything in his training or imagination. Complete power loss across all 4 engines, Ramon stated with professional composure that barely masked the terror underlying those words, her fingers already moving through restart procedures that commercial aviation protocol demanded but which her instincts suggested would prove futile against whatever had caused simultaneous failure across independent systems. Airspeed 340 knots, altitude 37,000 feet, rate of descent initiating at 400 feet per minute. Torres engaged the auxiliary power unit while attempting restart procedures on Engine 1, following the precise sequence that training had embedded so deeply that his hands moved correctly despite his mind struggling to process the unprecedented nature of their situation. The engine refused to respond, its turbine remaining silent as fuel pumps engaged and igniters fired into combustion chambers that should have roared back to life but instead maintained their terrible silence. He moved to Engine 2 with identical results, then 3 and 4, each attempt confirming what he already knew but refused to accept, that Flight 312 had lost all propulsion with no indication that restart procedures would restore power. Mayday Mayday Mayday, Transglobal 312 experiencing complete 4-engine failure at flight level 370, position approximately 100 miles east of Portland, Oregon, 312 souls on board, attempting restart procedures. Torres transmitted the emergency declaration with his voice remaining steady through professional discipline while his peripheral vision caught Ramon calculating glide ratios and descent rates that would determine whether they lived or died during the next 20 minutes. The mathematics delivered devastating conclusions with impartial precision. The 747-400 could maintain approximately 15-to-1 glide ratio under optimal conditions, meaning they might cover 15 miles forward for every mile of altitude lost. Starting from 37,000 feet provided roughly 7 miles of altitude, theoretically allowing them to glide perhaps 100 miles before impact. But that distance assumed ideal configuration and expert energy management, and even perfect execution would not reach any airport capable of handling their massive aircraft within the terrain they currently crossed. Seattle-Tacoma is 140 miles behind us, Portland International is 90 miles south-southwest, no suitable runways within our glide range, Ramon reported while her displays showed topography that offered nothing suitable for emergency landing. Dense forest covering mountainous terrain interrupted by valleys too narrow and irregular for aircraft requiring thousands of feet of relatively flat surface. Calculating emergency landing options for terrain within our glide envelope. Seattle Center responded with controlled urgency, their controller coordinating immediately with military assets while providing vectors toward the flattest terrain within Flight 312's potential glide range. Torres heard the professionalism in the controller's voice but also detected the underlying awareness that they were managing an emergency that commercial aviation considered theoretically unsurvivable. Massive four-engine aircraft simply did not successfully land without any power, their size and weight requiring thrust for controlled approach that gliding could not provide. Torres made the announcement that every captain dreaded, his words transmitted through the cabin address system reaching 312 passengers who had boarded expecting routine transportation and who now faced mortality with 37,000 feet remaining before impact. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Torres speaking. We have experienced complete engine failure and are currently gliding without power. We are coordinating with ground control for emergency landing. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing procedures. Everyone remain calm and follow crew instructions exactly. The professional composure of his delivery could not mask the unprecedented nature of what he had just announced, and Torres heard the immediate reaction rippling through the passenger cabin, gasps and cries and the rising sound of 312 people simultaneously processing their own potential deaths. Lead Flight Attendant Maria Santos began coordinating her crew with practiced efficiency born from training exercises that had always seemed distant and theoretical but which now represented their only organizational structure against chaos threatening to overwhelm passengers facing imminent crash. Among those 312 passengers, sitting in economy class seat 47K near the aircraft's tail section, a woman dressed in worn canvas work jacket and faded jeans maintained external calm while her mind immediately began analyzing the situation with expertise that none of the surrounding passengers could possibly suspect. Sarah Chen appeared completely ordinary to casual observation, weathered hands suggesting manual labor, simple clothing indicating rural working-class background, unremarkable appearance that invited no second glances from travelers who had their own concerns occupying their attention. The passengers around her reacted with predictable variety to the captain's announcement. The businessman in 47J began frantically texting family members while fighting tears that streaked down his face unchecked. The college student in 47H started hyperventilating until the flight attendant provided oxygen and calming instructions. The elderly couple across the aisle clutched each other with the resignation of people who had lived full lives but still desperately wanted more time. Nobody paid attention to the farmer woman who sat quietly processing technical information that the captain's strained voice had revealed to anyone with sufficient expertise to interpret the implications. Sarah had immediately recognized that Torres was following commercial procedures for four-engine failure, attempting restart sequences that might work for isolated engine problems but which would prove futile if they faced the systematic failure his tone suggested. She heard the professional composure barely masking his awareness that commercial training had not adequately prepared him for total power loss on massive aircraft over unsuitable terrain, that standard glide procedures assumed either partial power or accessible airports rather than complete silence over forested mountains. Her military training kicked in with automatic precision as she calculated glide ratios and assessed terrain options using mental models developed during 15 years as test pilot for experimental aircraft operations at Edwards Air Force Base and classified facilities whose names remained restricted even decades after her retirement. Sarah Chen had specialized in the impossible, flying aircraft through total power loss scenarios, developing procedures for landing massive planes without engines, pioneering techniques that military aviation researched because warfare demanded preparation for every conceivable failure regardless of statistical likelihood. She had personally executed 47 no-power landings during her military career, flying everything from experimental bombers to prototype transports through controlled failures designed to develop procedures that might save crews if multiple systems failed simultaneously during combat operations. The classified research had explored territory that commercial aviation considered too unlikely to warrant extensive training, but military necessity had demanded expertise for scenarios that seemed impossible until warfare made them reality. Sarah recognized immediately that Flight 312 faced exactly the situation her military research had addressed: massive four-engine aircraft descending without power over terrain offering no suitable landing sites within glide range. She knew from direct experience that commercial procedures would likely prove inadequate because they assumed conditions that their current emergency did not provide, that Torres needed techniques military test operations had developed but which classified restrictions had prevented from entering commercial training programs. The flight attendants moved through the cabin demonstrating brace positions and reviewing emergency procedures with voices that maintained professional steadiness despite their awareness that four-engine total failure represented nightmare scenario where survival depended more on luck than preparation. Sarah watched passengers following instructions with varying degrees of composure while her mind ran calculations about descent rates and energy management that would determine whether anyone survived the next 18 minutes. She made her decision with the same calm determination that had characterized her approach to every test flight that pushed aircraft beyond normal limits. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood despite the seatbelt sign illuminated above, moving forward through the cabin with quiet purpose while passengers around her assumed she was panicking or needed assistance from crew members better equipped to handle emergencies. Maria Santos intercepted her near the forward galley with professional concern mixed with mild irritation at passenger noncompliance during critical procedures. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately and fasten your seatbelt. We're preparing for emergency landing." "I'm a former military test pilot," Sarah stated quietly but with unmistakable authority, her voice carrying none of the panic that would indicate passenger hysteria. "I've landed aircraft without engines multiple times during classified operations. Your captain is following commercial procedures that won't work for the terrain you're facing. I can help you." Santos hesitated, her training insisting that passengers claiming special qualifications during emergencies usually represented well-meaning interference rather than genuine expertise, but something in Sarah's calm technical precision suggested this might be different. "What do you mean our procedures won't work?" "Your captain is optimizing for maximum glide distance to reach an airport, but you're over mountainous forest with no suitable runways within your glide envelope," Sarah explained with the same clinical precision she had used during military briefings. "Commercial training assumes you'll reach some kind of prepared surface. Military test operations develop techniques for landing massive aircraft on unprepared terrain when no airports exist within range. I've personally executed those procedures 47 times. Your captain has never done it once because commercial aviation doesn't train for scenarios they consider statistically impossible." Santos studied Sarah's weathered face and work-worn hands that seemed completely inconsistent with claims of military aviation expertise, but the technical specificity of her explanation suggested knowledge beyond anything a typical passenger would possess. "How do I know you're telling the truth? Call Edwards Air Force Base Flight Test Operations and ask about Sarah Chen, test pilot callsign Sierra Charlie 04, Sarah responded immediately. "Or don't verify and let your captain attempt landing using procedures that will likely result in catastrophic crash because his training never covered total power loss over terrain like this. Your choice, but you're running out of altitude for verification calls." The mathematical reality that they were descending at roughly 1,500 feet per minute made Santos's decision for her. She keyed her interphone to the cockpit with hands that trembled slightly despite her professional composure. "Captain, I have a passenger claiming to be a former military test pilot who says she's landed aircraft without engines and wants to help." Torres initially responded with the frustration of someone managing unprecedented emergency while dealing with passenger interference, but Santos cut him off. Sir, she provided specific technical information about why commercial procedures won't work for our terrain and gave a military call sign for verification. Given our situation, I think you should at least talk to her. 30 seconds later, Sarah stood in the cockpit doorway while Torres and Ramon stared at her with expressions mixing desperation and disbelief. The farmer woman looked completely out of place among the sophisticated instrumentation and professional atmosphere, but her first words demonstrated expertise that made their skepticism irrelevant. You're maintaining 320 knots trying to maximize distance, but that speed is too high for the terrain you'll actually reach, Sarah stated while her eyes scanned the instruments with the automatic efficiency of someone who had spent thousands of hours in similar cockpits. You need to slow to best glide speed of 280 knots and start configuring for unprepared surface landing rather than airport approach. The valley system 15 miles ahead offers your best option, wider than others, relatively flat bottom, river providing clearance indicator. Torres felt his professional pride resisting guidance from a passenger whose qualifications he could not verify while simultaneously recognizing that her technical precision exceeded anything his commercial training had provided for their unprecedented situation. What makes you think you know better than commercial procedures? Because I spent 15 years at Edwards developing procedures for exactly this scenario, Sarah responded without defensiveness or ego, just clinical statement of fact. Military test operations explored total power loss on heavy aircraft because combat situations might create failures that peacetime commercial aviation considers impossible. I personally pioneered techniques for landing four-engine aircraft without any thrust on unprepared terrain. You've trained for engine-out procedures assuming you'd reach an airport. I've trained for what happens when there is no airport. Ramon had already pulled up their projected ground track and identified the valley Sarah referenced, her professional assessment recognizing that the topography did indeed offer better crash potential than the densely forested slopes surrounding them. Even if you're telling the truth, how do we know your techniques will work on a 747? I developed them on C-5 Galaxy and experimental heavy transports that exceed your aircraft's weight, Sarah answered while her hands gestured toward the instrument panel with the unconscious familiarity of someone who had operated similar controls countless times. The principles are identical: energy management without thrust, terrain assessment for improvised landing sites, configuration timing for unpowered touchdown. The physics don't care whether you're military or commercial, they care whether you understand how to optimize every variable when engines provide zero help. Torres made the decision that terror and desperation forced upon him despite everything his training and pride insisted should govern his actions. They had perhaps 14 minutes before impact, no engines showed any response to restart procedures, and this woman demonstrated technical knowledge that suggested genuine expertise regardless of her implausible appearance. Okay, tell us what to do. Sarah moved beside the captain's seat with calm authority that transformed the cockpit dynamic from commercial crew managing emergency to military test operation executing impossible procedure. First, reduce to 280 knots immediately. You're trading excess speed for minimal distance gain while making your eventual touchdown faster and harder to control. Second, identify your emergency landing site now rather than continuing to hope for airport access. That valley system ahead provides 3 miles of relatively clear corridor following the river drainage, not ideal, but workable if we execute correctly. Torres reduced throttles reflexively before recognizing the absurdity of that action without engines, instead raising the nose slightly to bleed excess speed while Park updated their glide calculations based on the new parameters. Ramon coordinated with Seattle Center providing their intended emergency landing location while Sarah continued her systematic guidance. Third, start configuring your mindset for terrain landing rather than runway landing, Sarah continued with the same clinical precision. You've trained your entire career to touch down on prepared surfaces with emergency equipment standing by. We're landing in a river valley with trees on both sides and unknown obstacles. Your training says that's unsurvivable. My experience says it's survivable if you execute with absolute precision and accept that survival means walking away from wreckage rather than taxiing to a gate. Park accessed weather data for their projected landing site while Ramon worked through emergency checklists that seemed absurdly inadequate for their situation. Sarah observed their professional coordination with approval, recognizing competent crew adapting to unprecedented circumstances despite lacking the specific training their emergency demanded. "You're passing through 30,000 feet, which gives us roughly 11 minutes before impact at current descent rate," Sarah stated while her mental calculations ran continuously. "We need to use this altitude for positioning rather than distance. The valley entrance is at your 11 o'clock, 22 miles ahead. That's reachable with altitude remaining for approach management." Torres had banked gently toward the coordinates while his mind struggled to process that he was accepting navigation guidance from a passenger whose credentials remained unverified while attempting landing that exceeded every parameter in his commercial training. But her technical precision and calm authority suggested expertise born from genuine experience rather than passenger panic, and the mathematical reality that all his training provided no better alternatives made the decision almost simple despite its absurdity. Seattle Center coordinated military assets monitoring the unprecedented emergency, with F-22 Raptors from Joint Base Lewis McChord scrambled to observe and provide real-time reconnaissance of Flight 312's projected landing zone. The fighters climbed rapidly toward intercept positions where their advanced sensors could assess terrain and transmit detailed imagery that might improve the commercial crew's chances of survival. Sarah continued her systematic guidance as they descended through 25,000 feet with the terrain below transitioning from abstract topography to visible geographical features that would soon become landing environment. Start thinking about your energy management in 3 phases. Phase 1 is positioning, getting lined up with the valley entrance without excessive speed or altitude. Phase 2 is descent management within the valley, maintaining control while losing altitude in confined space. Phase 3 is touchdown execution, getting the aircraft on the ground while managing energy you cannot adjust with thrust. "What about flaps and landing gear?" Ramon asked while her hands hovered near the configuration controls. "Standard procedure calls for maximum drag to steepen approach. Not for unprepared terrain landing," Sarah corrected immediately. "You'll configure minimum flaps for touchdown, just enough for controlled speed without excessive drag that prevents you from reaching your landing site. Landing gear stays retracted until the final seconds because extended gear creates massive drag and you cannot afford to come up short. Belly landing on gear up provides better energy dissipation than catastrophic collapse if you hit obstacles with wheels extended." Torres felt every instinct developed across 28 years resisting the idea of intentional gear-up landing, but Sarah's explanation made terrible sense for terrain that offered no runway and countless obstacles that might destroy extended landing gear on initial contact. They were attempting crash landing with maximum survival probability rather than normal landing with standard procedures, and those different objectives demanded different techniques regardless of how much they violated commercial training. The F-22's established positions flanking Flight 312's descent path, their pilots observing the massive commercial jet gliding silently through 20,000 feet while maintaining remarkable stability despite complete power loss. The fighter pilots transmitted reconnaissance data to Seattle Center while privately discussing among themselves the unprecedented nature of witnessing 4-engine commercial aircraft attempting unpowered landing in mountainous terrain. Flight 312, Raptor 21 has visual contact and is transmitting terrain imagery of your projected landing zone, the F-22 lead pilot announced over the emergency frequency. Valley floor shows river channel with gravel bars providing some clear areas. Trees line both sides with approximately 400 feet clearance at widest point. Recommend approach from south-southwest following river drainage to valley entrance. Sarah nodded with approval at the reconnaissance information, her military background immediately recognizing the value of having fighter assets providing real-time intelligence about landing environment that the commercial crew could not adequately assess from their altitude and position. "Captain, the Raptors are giving you exactly what you need. Use their information to visualize your approach path. You're going to enter the valley at approximately 5,000 feet altitude with 260 knots airspeed, then manage your descent to touch down on those gravel bars the fighters identified." They descended through 15,000 feet with the valley system now visible ahead, its terrain features resolving into specific obstacles and clearances that would determine whether 312 people lived or died during the next 8 minutes. Sarah maintained her systematic guidance while Torres and Ramon implemented her instructions with the tentative precision of pilots executing procedures they had never trained for under circumstances exceeding their worst nightmares. "Start your turn toward final approach heading," Sarah directed while her eyes tracked their position relative to the valley entrance. "You want to roll out aligned with the river drainage at 8,000 feet, giving you 3,000 feet of altitude for final approach management. Your descent rate should stabilize around 1,800 feet per minute, faster than normal approach but necessary to ensure you reach the landing zone rather than impacting short." Park monitored their energy state with growing respect for Sarah's guidance, recognizing that her instructions optimized every variable in ways his commercial training had never addressed. They were managing the massive aircraft as a glider rather than powered plane, treating altitude as their only resource and distance as their enemy, configuring for survival rather than comfort. The passengers behind them had fallen into terrible silence broken only by quiet sobbing and whispered prayers as the cabin crew completed emergency preparations that seemed inadequate for the impending violence of terrain impact. Maria Santos made final announcements about brace positions and emergency exits while privately acknowledging that successful evacuation assumed aircraft remaining sufficiently intact for doors to function and passengers to survive initial impact. Sarah sensed the moment approaching when theory would transform into execution, when her decades of classified research would prove valuable or worthless based on whether Flight 312 survived the next 6 minutes. "Captain, at 5,000 feet you'll configure flaps to 5 degrees. Not standard landing configuration, minimal drag for controlled touchdown. Landing gear remains retracted until I tell you otherwise. Your target is the gravel bar approximately 2 miles into the valley where the river widens slightly. That's your touchdown zone." Torres acknowledged while his hands gripped the control yoke with pressure that made his knuckles white despite his professional training insisting on relaxed inputs. Ramon had already briefed the landing configuration even as her mind rebelled against the idea of intentionally touching down with minimal flaps and retracted gear on terrain that offered no forgiveness for errors. They descended through 10,000 feet with the valley entrance ahead, its terrain features now clearly visible and terrifying in their implications. The river valley provided perhaps 400 feet of clearance between tree lines rising from slopes that offered instant death if they drifted off centerline. The gravel bars Sarah had identified as touchdown zone looked impossibly small and rough from their altitude, nothing like the wide smooth runways that commercial aviation took for granted. Passing through 8,000 feet, rolling out on final approach heading, Ramon reported with her voice maintaining professional steadiness despite the terror underlying each word. "Descent rate 1,900 feet per minute, airspeed 270 knots. Perfect positioning," Sarah confirmed while her mental calculations tracked their energy state against remaining distance. "Maintain current descent rate. You're going to overfly the valley entrance at 6,000 feet, then manage your descent within the valley corridor. This is where it gets interesting. You have only one chance to establish proper glide path because you cannot adjust with thrust." The F-22s maintained flanking positions while transmitting continuous updates about the valley environment, their pilots watching with professional fascination and growing respect as Flight 312 executed approach that exceeded anything in commercial aviation experience. The fighter pilots had trained for countless emergencies, but they had never witnessed civilian aircraft attempting military-level emergency procedures under circumstances that made survival seem statistically impossible. Torres felt the massive aircraft respond to his inputs with the sluggish handling characteristic of unpowered flight, the controls requiring more physical force and providing less immediate feedback than he had experienced during 3 decades of commercial operations. They were flying the 747 as glider, managing energy through careful pitch adjustments and accepting that mistakes would prove fatal because no thrust existed to compensate for errors. "Configure flaps 5 degrees, Sarah instructed as they passed through 6,000 feet approaching the valley entrance. "You're committed now. Whatever happens in the next 4 minutes determines whether we walk away or not. Trust your training, trust your aircraft, and trust that I know what I'm talking about because I've done this before." Torres selected flaps 5 while the massive wings extended partial trailing edge devices that increased lift and drag in carefully calculated proportion. The aircraft's handling changed subtly, providing more control authority while bleeding energy slightly faster, the configuration representing compromise between control and distance that Sarah's expertise had optimized for their specific situation. They entered the valley at 5,800 feet with the river channel below and tree-lined slopes rising on both sides, the clearance appearing terrifyingly narrow from the cockpit despite the reconnaissance data indicating 400 feet of lateral space. Torres made small corrections maintaining centerline while Ramon called out altitude and airspeed with mechanical precision that helped both pilots manage the approach through objective parameters rather than subjective terror. Descent rate looks good. Airspeed 265 knots, 4 miles to touchdown zone, Ramon reported while her displays showed the gravel bar ahead that represented their target. We're established on approach. Outstanding crew coordination, Sarah stated with genuine approval. Now comes energy management within the valley. You're going to be tempted to pull back and reduce descent rate because your commercial training says steep approach is dangerous. Ignore that training. You need this descent rate to ensure reaching the touchdown zone. Coming up short means impacting in water or trees before the gravel bar. The valley walls seemed to close around them as they descended through 4,000 feet with the gravel bar visible ahead, its surface looking rough and uneven in ways that made Torres question whether any aircraft could survive impact with terrain so unsuitable for aviation operations. But Sarah had said this represented their best option within glide range, and the mathematical reality that no alternatives existed made the decision simple despite its terrifying implications. 3,000 feet, 2 miles to touchdown, Park announced while his engineering training helped him appreciate the precision Sarah's guidance had achieved. They had managed their energy perfectly to arrive at proper altitude and position despite having no engines to correct mistakes. Landing gear down now, Sarah commanded with timing precision born from 47 previous executions. You need wheels for initial contact even if they collapse. Gear provides the first energy absorption before belly contact takes over. This is gear down crash landing, not gear up belly landing. I misspoke earlier. Torres selected landing gear down while feeling the massive hydraulic systems extend wheels that might provide salvation or catastrophe depending on whether the gravel bar could support their weight or would instead shatter the landing gear and send them tumbling through violent destruction. The gear indicators showed down and locked with the same green lights that had indicated normal landings throughout his career, except this touchdown would be anything but normal. 2,000 feet, 1 mile to touchdown, descent rate 2,000 feet per minute, Ramon called out while her hands braced against the instrument panel in unconscious preparation for impact. Airspeed 250 knots. You're slightly fast on airspeed but altitude is perfect, Sarah assessed with clinical precision. Maintain current approach. At 500 feet you'll execute gentle flare to reduce vertical velocity, but not aggressive flare that bleeds too much energy. You want to touch down with forward momentum that carries you through the gravel rather than dropping vertically onto it. The gravel bar filled their view ahead as they descended through 1,000 feet, the terrain features resolving into specific rocks and channels that would soon test whether Sarah's expertise matched her confidence. Torres could see the river on both sides of their intended touchdown zone, the trees beyond waiting to destroy them if they drifted off centerline or failed to stop within the available distance. 500 feet, beginning flare, Torres announced while pulling back gently on the control yoke to reduce their descent rate from 2,000 feet per minute to something that might allow survival upon contact. The massive aircraft responded with agonizing sluggishness, the unpowered flight providing no thrust to assist with the energy change he was attempting to execute through pitch alone. Steady pressure, don't over-rotate, Sarah coached while her eyes tracked their descent with the same intense focus she had maintained during every test flight where failure meant death. 200 feet, looking good. 100 feet, maintain current pitch. 50 feet, brace for impact. The main landing gear contacted the gravel bar with violence that exceeded anything Torres had experienced during 28 years of commercial operations, the massive tires compressing then rebounding as the aircraft's 400 tons transferred momentum into terrain never designed to receive aircraft. The nose pitched forward dramatically as the main gear dug into gravel while forward momentum continued, the entire fuselage shuddering with forces that threatened structural failure. Nose gear contact. Ramon shouted as the forward landing gear impacted seconds later with equally tremendous force, the entire aircraft now in contact with terrain while traveling nearly 200 knots across surface, offering minimal friction and countless obstacles. Torres maintained back pressure on the yoke, trying to prevent nose gear collapse while simultaneously deploying spoilers to increase drag and reduce their speed. The gravel bar surface proved simultaneously better and worse than expected, solid enough to prevent the landing gear from completely collapsing but rough enough to create violent shaking that threatened to tear components from their mounts. The aircraft slewed slightly right as the right main gear encountered softer ground, Torres correcting with aggressive rudder input that brought them back toward centerline while their speed decreased with agonizing slowness. Behind them in the passenger cabin, 312 people experienced the violent touchdown with impacts that exceeded anything their bodies had trained for, the emergency brace positions helping prevent injuries but unable to eliminate the physical trauma of terrain impact at high speed. Santos and her crew maintained their positions while calling out reassurance to passengers convinced they were dying, the flight attendants' professional composure providing psychological anchor during violence that seemed certain to transition from survivable roughness to catastrophic destruction. The 747 continued its chaotic deceleration across the gravel bar with components failing from forces exceeding design parameters, tires shredding, landing gear struts compressing beyond normal limits, wing structures flexing dramatically as the aircraft's energy slowly transferred into terrain and destroyed parts. But the fundamental airframe maintained integrity despite the abuse, the fuselage remaining intact while they decelerated through 150 knots then 100 then 50. Sarah watched the touchdown execution with satisfaction, recognizing that Torres and Ramon had implemented her guidance with precision that maximized their survival probability despite having no previous experience with procedures she had pioneered. The aircraft was being destroyed through the landing, but destruction of components represented success if the passenger cabin remained intact and people survived. They finally shuttered to complete stop approximately 1 mile beyond initial touchdown after the longest 45 seconds of everyone's lives, the massive aircraft resting askew on collapsed main gear with its nose pitched slightly down but the fuselage fundamentally intact. Torres sat stunned in his seat while his hands remained frozen on the controls, his mind unable to immediately process that they had survived what commercial training insisted was unsurvivable. Shutdown procedures, evacuate immediately, Sarah stated calmly while her military training moved past survival to the next immediate concern of evacuating passengers before fire or fuel leaks created additional hazards. Outstanding execution, Captain. You just accomplished something maybe 5 pilots in the world could have done. Now get your passengers out. Torres's training reasserted itself through the shock as he initiated shutdown procedures on systems that had already failed, the motions providing psychological comfort of completing proper protocol despite circumstances rendering most procedures irrelevant. Ramon had already opened the cockpit door while Park coordinated with the cabin crew beginning emergency evacuation procedures they had trained for but never expected to execute after total engine failure. The emergency slides deployed on exits that remained functional despite the violent landing, with passengers evacuating into the river valley under Santos's professional coordination while the reality slowly penetrated that all 312 people had survived impossible emergency through techniques that commercial aviation did not teach and procedures that classified military research had developed. Emergency response teams had already been positioning during the descent, with helicopters and ground vehicles converging on the remote valley location where Flight 312 had accomplished what aviation experts would later describe as theoretically impossible. But the immediate priority remained evacuating passengers before fire hazards or structural failures created additional casualties after their miraculous survival. Sarah had moved with the evacuating passengers rather than remaining in the cockpit, her instinct to avoid attention reasserting itself even as Torres realized he had never properly thanked the woman whose expertise had saved everyone aboard. She had already disappeared into the crowd of survivors gathering at safe distance from the aircraft when military helicopters began arriving overhead. The F-22 pilots who had observed the entire emergency had reported real-time updates throughout Flight 312's descent and incredible landing, their transmissions maintaining professional composure appropriate for military communications even as their personal reactions had progressed from skepticism to amazement to stunned respect for whoever had coordinated the impossible achievement they had witnessed. But it was only after the successful landing when military coordination began identifying personnel involved in the emergency that the F-22 lead pilot received information that made him go completely silent on the military frequency for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in radio communications where pilots responded immediately to every transmission as fundamental discipline. "Say again your last transmission," the pilot finally requested, with his voice betraying unusual emotion for someone trained to maintain professional composure under any circumstances. "You're confirming that Sarah Chen from Edwards Classified Test Operations was aboard Flight 312 and coordinated the landing?" Seattle Center confirmed, while military databases had updated with information about Sarah's identification through passenger manifests cross-referenced with her previous military service records that remained partially classified decades after her retirement. The F-22 pilot had recognized the name immediately because military aviation used case studies from Sarah's research in advanced training that addressed catastrophic failures, her work representing legendary contributions that every test pilot studied even if her classified research had restricted broader distribution. Raptor 2-1 copies, the pilot transmitted with his voice barely maintaining composure while his mind processed the implications. "Request permission for low pass to honor successful landing." Seattle Center approved while the F-22 lead executed slow pass over the crash site at 500 feet, his wingman maintaining formation while both pilots dipped their wings in salute, recognizing one of military aviation's legends who had just applied her life's work to save 312 civilians through capabilities that classified research had developed but which everyone assumed would never prove necessary outside military test operations. The pilots maintained unusual silence on their flight back to base, both struggling to articulate the profound impact of witnessing Sarah Chen applying techniques she had pioneered to civilian emergency that commercial aviation had considered impossible. They had just observed someone whose name appeared in restricted files about experimental aircraft operations executing real-world application of theoretical research, proving that military test pilot expertise could translate to civilian life-saving despite predictions that such scenarios would never occur. The investigation would take months as aviation authorities attempted to understand how Transglobal Flight 312 had experienced simultaneous total failure across all four engines, an event so statistically improbable that no previous commercial flight had survived similar circumstances. But the immediate story that captured global attention was how a farmer passenger had revealed herself as military test pilot legend whose classified research had prepared her for exactly the impossible situation that everyone else considered unsurvivable. Passengers who had dismissed Sarah based on her rural appearance found themselves struggling to reconcile the weathered farmer with the technical expert who had saved their lives through capabilities they never suspected she possessed. The businessman in seat 47J who had ignored her throughout the flight waited 90 minutes for opportunity to shake her hand and offer thanks to someone whose competence had transcended every assumption he had made based on superficial observation. The aviation community experienced collective shock discovering that total four-engine failure had not resulted in catastrophic loss of life specifically because someone with Sarah Chen's qualifications had been aboard by sheer chance. Someone whose military test pilot expertise had prepared her to guide exactly the type of emergency that commercial aviation considered theoretically impossible and therefore did not extensively train for. Military aviation reacted with profound respect for witnessing one of their legendary figures applying pioneering research to save civilian lives during crisis that validated decades of classified work exploring scenarios too unlikely for commercial consideration. The F-22 pilot's stunned silence upon learning Sarah's identity had reflected the extraordinary reverence that military aviators held for test pilots who had developed procedures saving lives through innovations that peacetime operations hoped never to need but wartime reality eventually demanded. Sarah herself maintained characteristic modesty when finally located by investigators and media representatives, her response consistent with the same professional restraint she had demonstrated throughout her military career. She had been aboard Flight 312 returning from visiting family in Seattle, had recognized emergency requiring her expertise, and had provided guidance using procedures she had developed during classified research now partially declassified by necessity of explaining how Flight 312 had survived. "I was in the right place at the right time with the right experience," Sarah stated during the press conference that Anthropic and Transglobal had coordinated. "Captain Torres and his crew executed the landing. I just provided guidance based on research that military test operations had conducted decades ago." The real story is how well that crew adapted to procedures they had never trained for while managing an emergency that exceeded anything in commercial experience. But Torres had insisted during his own debriefing that Sarah's expertise had made the difference between survival and catastrophic loss, that her systematic guidance had optimized every variable in ways his commercial training could never have provided, that 312 people owed their lives to someone whose classified military research had prepared her for civilian emergency that aviation experts had considered impossible. The F-22 pilots requested and received permission to visit Sarah during the week following the emergency, both men wanting to personally express respect to someone whose work they had studied during their own training but whom they never expected to witness applying her pioneering research to real-world civilian crisis. Their meeting lasted 3 hours as Sarah answered questions about techniques she had developed and shared insights about test pilot mentality that treated impossible as merely difficult rather than unachievable. The investigation eventually determined that contaminated fuel had caused simultaneous failure across all 4 engines through cascade effect that multiple redundant systems had failed to prevent. 1 in 10 million occurrence that commercial aviation had considered too unlikely to warrant extensive procedure development but which military research had addressed because warfare-created situations where unlikely became reality and preparation made difference between catastrophe and survival. Aviation authorities began reviewing whether procedures for military test operations should become part of commercial training even for scenarios considered statistically improbable, recognizing that Flight 312 survival proved that expertise in impossible emergencies could save lives when statistics proved less reliable than preparation. Sarah returned to her farm in rural Washington where she had lived quietly since military retirement, maintaining the unassuming lifestyle that made her previous career seem implausible to casual observers but which people who knew her expertise recognized as characteristic modesty from someone whose achievements needed no external validation. She had spent 15 years pioneering techniques that saved 312 civilians during one extraordinary emergency, proving that classified military research could provide civilian value when impossible became reality and expertise proved more important than probability. The F-22 pilots maintained contact with Sarah, their relationship evolving from professional respect to genuine friendship as they recognized in her the same dedication to aviation excellence that motivated their own careers. They privately acknowledged that their stunned silence upon learning her identity had reflected appropriate response to witnessing legendary figure applying life's work to impossible situation, moments so profound that even elite fighter pilots found themselves speechless with recognition and respect. Captain Torres visited Sarah's farm 3 months after the emergency, bringing his crew and their families to thank someone whose expertise had saved not just 312 passengers but the families and communities that would have lost those people if Flight 312 had crashed. Torres had requested and received early retirement after the emergency, his psychological assessment determining that surviving total 4-engine failure through unprecedented landing had created trauma preventing return to commercial operations regardless of his technical competence. "You saved my passengers, my crew, and myself when commercial training provided no solutions," Torres stated during that visit while standing in Sarah's modest living room that contained few outward indications of her extraordinary military career. "I spent 28 years believing my experience prepared me for any emergency. You taught me in 18 minutes that real expertise comes from places I never trained for and people I never recognized because I made assumptions based on appearances." Sarah had responded with characteristic modesty while privately appreciating that her classified research had ultimately proved valuable beyond military applications, that her decision to spend 15 years exploring impossible scenarios had been vindicated through civilian lives saved when statistics suggested such preparation would never be needed but reality created emergency requiring exactly the expertise she had developed. The 312 passengers maintained informal association following the emergency, their shared experience creating bonds that tragedy often forms but which survival made celebration rather than memorial. They gathered annually on the anniversary of Flight 312's impossible landing, their event including Torres and his crew and eventually Sarah herself after persistent invitations convinced her that acknowledging accomplishment did not conflict with the modesty she maintained about capabilities that speaking plainly served others better than false humility. The F-22 pilots who had witnessed the landing attended those annual gatherings when their operational schedules permitted, Their presence representing military aviation's recognition that Flight 312 had demonstrated civilian application of test pilot expertise that classified research had developed for scenarios everyone hoped would remain theoretical but which Sarah's genius had prepared her to execute when impossible became reality. Military aviation updated training programs to include case studies from Flight 312's emergency, recognizing that Sarah's coordination had demonstrated practical application of techniques that test operations had pioneered but which broader aviator community had never fully appreciated because peacetime made catastrophic failure seem too unlikely to warrant extensive preparation. Sarah continued living quietly on her farm, maintaining the unassuming lifestyle that made her previous career seem implausible except to people who knew that extraordinary expertise often resided in unexpected places with people who never needed external validation to confirm accomplishments that speaking plainly served others better than false modesty or excessive pride. The passengers of Flight 312 returned to their lives carrying awareness that survival had depended on someone whose appearance had invited dismissal but whose capabilities had transcended every assumption they had made based on superficial observations. They had learned viscerally that expertise takes forms that casual observation cannot assess, that the farmer in economy class seat 47K had possessed qualifications exceeding the commercial crew because her military career had prepared her for scenarios that commercial aviation considered impossible until reality proved otherwise. The annual gatherings included moments of silence honoring not just their survival but Sarah's willingness to apply her expertise during crisis when she could have remained anonymous among 312 passengers hoping someone else would provide solutions. She had stood with quiet determination and offered capabilities that classified military research had developed, proving that test pilot expertise could save civilian lives when impossible became reality and preparation proved more valuable than statistical probability. Captain Torres maintained regular contact with Sarah, their relationship evolving from emergency coordination to genuine friendship as he recognized that her modest exterior concealed not just technical expertise but fundamental decency that motivated her intervention despite personal preference for anonymity. She had saved his passengers not for recognition or reward but because her capabilities could help when help was desperately needed, motivation consistent with service mentality that military aviation cultivated and which the best personnel maintained throughout civilian lives following retirement. The F-22 pilots who had observed Flight 312's impossible landing privately acknowledged that their stunned silence upon learning Sarah's identity had represented appropriate response to witnessing legend applying life's work to save civilians through techniques that military research had developed but which everyone assumed would never prove necessary outside test operations where catastrophic failures represented experimental conditions rather than real-world emergencies. Sarah Chen's story became legend within aviation communities as example of expertise residing in unexpected places with people whose appearance invited dismissal but whose capabilities transcended assumptions based on superficial observation. She had pioneered techniques during classified military research that proved their civilian value during one extraordinary emergency when total four-engine failure created situation exceeding commercial training and requiring exactly the specialized knowledge that her test pilot career had developed through decades exploring impossible scenarios. The 312 passengers of Transglobal Flight 312 lived their lives carrying awareness that survival had depended on military test pilot living civilian life as farmer whose modest appearance had concealed capabilities that saved them when commercial aviation's best training proved inadequate for unprecedented emergency requiring expertise that classified research had developed and legendary figure had applied with systematic precision born from 47 previous executions of procedures most pilots never imagined attempting. And somewhere in rural Washington, Sarah Chen maintained her unassuming farm life while occasionally receiving visitors from aviation community wanting to express respect to someone whose classified research had proved its civilian value when impossible became reality and her test pilot expertise applied techniques she had pioneered to coordinate landing that military professionals considered extraordinary achievement deserving profound recognition, including stunned silence from F-22 Raptor pilots who witnessed legendary figure saving 312 civilians through capabilities that transcended every expectation and validated lifetime of work exploring scenarios too unlikely for commercial consideration but which military necessity had demanded someone prepare for just in case statistics proved less reliable than expertise when survival depended on impossible becoming achievable through preparation meeting opportunity in ways that left even elite aviators speechless with Recognition and respect.